Care Network 2019 Fall Forum on Opioid Use Disorder through the lens of trauma-informed care. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this meeting takes place on the traditional meeting grounds of Treaty 6 First Nation, and we honor and respect the history and culture that continues to enrich our vibrant community today. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you can put your cell phones on vibrate, that would be appreciated. And note that tonight's session is being recorded so that we can share it with people who were unable to attend. And you'll get more details about how that will be available. And as I said before, most of the camera focus will be on the speakers, but if you really don't want your image captured, then let us know and we'll try to avoid that or edit it. Washrooms are located out the door and to your left. And in case of emergency, please exit to the left through the doors to the parking lot, and there is a muster point outside in the parking lot. And before we get started, we thought today would be a great opportunity to share with you the new Alberta Find a Doc promotional information. We all know that people experience better health outcomes when they have a family doctor, and the PCN is committed to improving access and attachment of patients to a family physician. The new Alberta Find a Doc website will launch in a few weeks. It's a provincial initiative, and it's based on our old Edmonton area Find a Doc website. It will provide information and resources for patients looking for a physician. It has a much more robust search feature, and it will also help provide information for patients about their primary care network that they belong to. There are some posters and business cards which you can hand out to people looking for a physician, and that will be available at the back at the reception, so you can grab a package on your way out if you'd like to. The information on the website is updated 4 times a year regarding who's taking patients, but if you have a change of status or you want to change the information, email me, and one of our PCN team members will make the changes for you. So, to get on to our main topic for today, the opioid crisis was declared in 2017, and our PCN has been involved from the beginning, partnering with AHS to provide the first opioid dependency program that was housed within a PCN. We also hosted the first zone-wide education event that was about opioid agonist response therapy, treating and managing chronic pain, prevention, and other topics. And we now also have an opioid response coordinator who will help to build capacity in our offices to treat patients with opioid use disorder, because we know, and studies have shown, that people that are treated within their family physician's office have better success, a better experience, and are more likely to stay in treatment. And we can argue about how much physicians are to blame for the opioid crisis and for the problem, but it's increasingly clear that we're a crucial part of the solution. And just as the causes are not that simple to figure out, I think the treatment is also very complex. And that's why we have asked Dr. Mazzeco and Dr. Easton to come and talk to us about trauma-informed care. And I know I've heard from a couple of people, oh my God, I want to hear about opioid dependency disorder anymore. But I think that this is such an important topic, looking at it through the lens of trauma-informed care. And it is a topic that has wide-ranging importance, not just for addictions and mental health, but for chronic pain patients, for morbidly obese patients, for patients with mental health issues. So I think it's an excellent topic that covers not just opioid use disorder, but a variety of issues that we need to take into account for our patients. So please welcome Dr. Francesco Mazzeco, who is the medical director of Boyle McCauley Health Center, and Dr. Nancy Easton, who's a family physician. Both presenters practice out of the Boyle McCauley Health Center and provide interdisciplinary, team-based primary health care to vulnerable populations in Edmonton inner city. Boyle McCauley is the only nonprofit community-owned and operated health center in the greater Edmonton area. Addictions and mental health services are embedded in their program. Nancy is also the family physician at the youth clinic that is associated with Britannia School and is an initiative that RPCN helped to facilitate. They are going to review with us the science and findings that are related to impacts of developmental trauma on brain development and related adverse health outcomes in adulthood. They are going to review the Boyle McCauley experience of applying the Adverse Child Experience Survey in primary care as a means to better understand and engage clients, especially with substance use disorder. And they're going to explore pearls for providing trauma-informed care to improve client engagement and health outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maseko and Dr. Easton.
My wife and I have 4 sons, and so one of the mainstay activities at home is wrestling, and I found my glasses kept getting broken, and so a few years ago I went to have corrective laser eye surgery. And my wife had prepped the boys because we wouldn't be able to wrestle after I had the surgery. And so they knew it was coming up, and my wife had taken the boys to the gym, and when they were in child minding there, they get these little kind of paper plastic wristbands. And she noticed that our oldest son, who was 5 at the time, didn't want to have his cut off. So after a few days, she said, "Look, I can just cut that off for you." And he said, "No, Mom, I want Dad to do it with his laser eyes." So sometimes I find working with marginalized populations, working with individuals who have complex substance use disorders, makes me feel like I would like to have superpowers like laser eyes or something that would be more useful in that context. However, I do think that there's a lot of tools and approaches that we can use that can help us to engage with individuals who have substance use disorders, and I think it's far-reaching past just that diagnosis. So I'm Francesco Mosaico. I've been a physician full-time at the Boyle McCauley Health Center for about 12 years, and I did my residency at Queen's Medical School here at the U of A, and I have a certificate of added competence in addictions medicine. And my colleague, Nancy Easton.
I'm a fairly recent grad. I've been working at the Boyle McCauley off and on for about 2 years, and I'm now there full-time and practicing family medicine. And then both Francesco and I are terrible with PowerPoint. He used to give this presentation just by Googling the websites to show people the websites, and we would go through. So we had a ton of help from Maria Ward, who's one of the awesome LPNs at our clinic. And so any positive feedback you have about the technology, you should send her away.
Oh, this is...
So I think Wendy sort of went through this, but tonight we're really just hoping to help you all become a little bit more familiar with a study called the CDC Kaiser ACES survey and some of the clinical applications of that study that we use in the treatment of substance use disorders within primary care at our clinic, and that I've also used previously in work at other primary care clinics in more fee-for-service roles. And then we want to just give you guys some tools and some resources that you can use to become more comfortable with this, if this is something that you want to try and incorporate into your own practice.
All right, and so a lot of the work that's been done here in Alberta has been facilitated by the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, and as I've begun applying this in frontline practice, they've encouraged me to do presentations with them, and so I'll have expenses reimbursed, but no remuneration. But Nancy thought we should declare any conflict of interest, so there it is. Okay, so case study, and I would invite any audience participation if you have thoughts about how to approach this. So true story. This happened a couple of years ago, but I had a young man, he was in his mid to late 20s, come in on a Saturday morning clinic. And he had been prescribed by another physician some medications for nebulous back pain, and it was fairly high dose opioids, dispensed a week at a time. And he was about 3 days into his prescription, and he came in, and the story he presented with was he'd gone swimming with his 1-year-old daughter, and while he was swimming, someone broke into his locker and stole his medications. And so he just needed a refill so he could move on with his day. So what are some of your initial thoughts, or what are some of what's your approach when you see something like that? And, he first presented to, our MOA, our nurses, and then he sees me. So I know that there's a variety of disciplines represented by the people here tonight. So if you have any thoughts about how you would approach it, or how you have approached something like this in the past, that'd be great. If not, I'll just tell you what I do. Anyone? Bueller?
There's a hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please.
Why are you bringing your meds to the swimming pool?
Okay, great question. Anything else? There's really no wrong or right answer. I just kind of want to get people to think about what they would do in that situation, or what assumptions would you make. Yes, please. Okay, great. So you check the PIN profile in Netcare, see if what he's corroborate, the prescribing history. Anything else? What assumptions might you make off the bat? Drug seeking. Okay, great. So fairly similar to what I felt initially, and our nurses are very adept at checking histories and corroborating what people have told us. And so so the nurses actually went and they called the swimming pool and they said, can you tell us, there was a break-in, some guy said he lost his medications, his wallet. They said, nope, that hasn't happened today. So I was able to go back into the room, and we talked about it, and the story became more and more elaborate, and then finally, he realized that he just couldn't get out of the situation. He had to admit he was lying, and so he just said, fine. He said, I'll just leave. I know I'm not going to get a prescription. He said, and I said, well, you don't have to leave. Can we talk about this a little bit? And he said, okay, fine. And I said, well, it's okay that you lied to me, but we have to talk about this, and maybe we can reframe what's going on. And so I said, so he admitted he had a substance use disorder, primarily opioids, and that was just when the fentanyl crisis was being recognized for what it was, and methamphetamine use as well. And so anyways, he talked really discouragedly about his experience as what he self-described as an addict, as a junkie. And he talked about how he wished he could quit, how he had tried multiple times to quit, how his relationship with his ex-girlfriend was even more tenuous than he would have imagined it would be in. He was going to lose custody of his kid. He did not have his daughter with him that day swimming, so that was part of but he did have a daughter and a partner that he was trying to reconnect with. And so I said, well, let's reframe this. And I said, I want to tell you about some research that came out in the early 90s. And I just took him through what we're going to kind of take you through today. So I told him about the study, and are people familiar with the Kaiser Permanente ACES study? Just by show of hands, if you heard about it? Okay, good. So maybe some of this will be worthwhile to some of you. So in the early 90s, there was a internist who was working on weight loss in San Diego, and they worked with people who had really severe obesity, severe morbid obesity, and they developed this food program that helped people lose a tremendous amount of weight in a very short period of time. And then he describes an experience he had when one individual had lost something like 275 pounds in a year, which we now know is probably not the healthiest approach, but beside the fact, she regained the weight. And so he started to explore why that had happened. And so if you want to learn more about this, one resource is CBC actually did a really excellent radio documentary in their program All in the Family. And it's 3 parts. And so this audio clip you're going to hear is Vincent Folletti, who is the internist who was conducting this obesity study. This wasn't the ACES study yet, but it was the precursor to it. So we'll just listen for a few minutes, and he'll describe this experience that he had with someone who was struggling with a health issue, weight, and the impact that the insight had. Please.
She was 28 years old.
Can you guys hear it at the back?
She was a nurse's aide.
Yeah, can you hear it at the back now?
At the back?
Okay, we'll just replay that.
You say a woman named Patty was a major catalyst for changing your ideas about obesity. How so?
Well, she was a woman in the early years of the program. She was 28 years old. She was a nurse's aide on a night shift in a convalescent hospital, and she weighed 408 pounds. And she came in to see us and asked if we could help her with her problem. And we naively said, sure, and entered her in the program, and in 51 weeks took her from 408 to 132.
So almost 300 pounds, is it?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we were suitably impressed, thinking, my God, look at what we can do. We must really know what we're doing. She maintained that weight for several weeks, and then came in, and in a 3-week period had regained 37 pounds, which I had believed at that point would have been physiologically impossible. And I remember asking her, what she thought was going on. And she said, I think I'm sleep eating. And I responded, what do you mean? And she said, well, when I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker. I haven't done that for years, but I live alone and everything is clean and put away when I go to bed. I wake up in the morning, pots and dishes are dirty, boxes and cans are open. It's obvious somebody's been cooking and eating there. I'm the only person, but I have no recollection of it whatsoever. And I remember asking her why she thought it was happening now. Why not last year? Why not next year? Why now? And she responded she didn't know, and I asked her what she thought. Well, I don't know. Yeah, but what do you think? I don't know. Yeah, you said that, but what do you think? And on the 3rd pass, she stumbled and said, well, someone at work, a much older man, he was married, said to me, hey, Patty, you look pretty good now that you've lost all that weight. How about you and me making it every week? And that was the day the sleep eating began. And I remember thinking, well, that's certainly a pretty clumsy sexual proposition. And in terms of pursuing why the extreme response, out came a lengthy incest history over a number of years with her grandfather's brother. And suddenly even her job made sense. I mean, basically she was paid to stay awake and on her feet all night long, watching over the old people in the convalescent hospital while they were asleep, and then she went home in the daytime to sleep in her own place. Then we quickly were finding other patients with similar histories. What's rare is ever for anyone to bring it up on their own, and equally rare for anyone ever to inquire about it.
So this woman's story, Patty, it gave Dr. Folletti and his team the understanding that there's a connection between child abuse and obesity, something that really hadn't been considered before.
Okay. So I just kind of paraphrased what you just heard to this client who'd come in. And as I was telling him the story, he just blanched. He just became so pale, and he was kind of gripping the arms of the chair, and he said, I don't believe this. And I said, do you want to talk about this? And he's like, no. He said, just keep telling me what you got to tell me. So I explained to him that Dr. Folletti then, he went back through some of the individuals who had rebounded in terms of their weight management, and he had found a common denominator amongst most of the people that they had been survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And then he became fascinated with this concept that things that happen to us in our developmental years may be having an impact on adult health. And for some of us, we think, well, that's a fairly obvious conclusion to arrive at, right? If things happen in our developmental years, it's probably going to affect us, but there was never any research, there was never any science that demonstrated that with a bit more, well, I don't think anything's ever conclusive, but it had never really been studied, and what's more is that people didn't really understand why there would be that link. And so what happened is that as Dr. Folletti kept working on this, that an internist turned epidemiologist at the Center for Diseases Control heard about his work, and so they teamed up and they were able to access the resources of the CDC together with Dr. Folletti's initial work. And what they did is they conducted the initial ACES study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And initially there was about 160 questions, and they asked about 17,000 people who were in a fairly stable socioeconomic demographic, mostly white, upper middle class, housed, and they asked them all these questions, but what they found is that there were 10 questions that if people responded to affirmatively would then link to a higher risk of illness in adulthood. And so those 10 questions became known as the ACES survey. And so as people would take this survey, they'd answer 10 questions, and every time you'd answer yes, you'd get a point, and then you tally the points and you get a score out of 10. And so what they found though, and I have a clip from Rob Anda, who is the CDC epidemiologist who worked on the study. They found as soon as someone hit a score of 4, they saw the risk of illness in adulthood start to escalate pretty dramatically. And so they started using the ACES survey fairly consistently. And so I'm just going to take you through it really briefly. And I actually did this with this young man who was in the office with me. I have a favorite, like there's so many versions of this that you can access, paper, digital. I like this one. I just Google ACES survey. It's a second link, and it takes you through it digitally. And I'm careful to frame it in a way, so I tell them I'm going to be asking you some fairly personal questions. You just have to say yes or no. If you want to stop at any time, that's fine. But I think it will help us to understand why you may be experiencing some of the struggles that you do in your day-to-day life. And I also kind of contextualize these questions for them, and I say, your household could be anywhere you grew up. It could be your biological family, a foster family, any of the 10 foster families you had. It could have been a street family you had. It could have been when you were in residential school, and so forth. It was the interactions you had as a child or during your developmental years. So the first question addresses emotional abuse, and they frame it. And you can look this up yourself. I won't go through this too pedantically, but before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? And then the second question, similar wording, but asks about emotional abuse. Well, that was emotional abuse. That was the first question. Second one was physical abuse. Third question relates to sexual abuse. Fourth question relates to emotional abuse, emotional neglect. Fifth question relates to physical neglect. And this was an interesting one. This didn't happen with this young man, but I remember asking an individual, a woman, if she felt like she'd been physically neglected, and she said no. And then later in the survey, she talked about when her dad was drunk, how she had to take her siblings and they lived in the doghouse for a couple days until he sobered up. And I said, well, would that be appropriate if you heard that your grandkids were doing that? And she said, never. And so then she rethought it, and she thought she had normalized the experience. But when you talk to people and they can kind of contextualize it a bit differently and suspend the judgment that they might feel will be imposed on their household, right? You sometimes get a different answer. So the next one was separation from biological parents for any reason, divorce, abandonment, death, being placed in a residential school, The 7th question relates to witnessing the maternal figure in their life being treated violently. The 8th question relates to untreated substance use disorders in the household. And the 9th question relates to untreated mental illness in the family. And the last question relates to if a household member went to prison. And so I say between the ages of 0 and 18 did these things happen. And then it tallies your score. And so then what does the score mean? And in this individual's case, the young man that I spoke about initially, his score was 10 out of 10. And and he talked to me a little bit about it, and he said, when I was a kid growing up, there were 2 adult men in my life who sexually abused me. And he said, I told my dad about it when I was 17, and he called me an effing liar. And that's when he became involved in the juvenile criminal justice system, and then his substance use disorder escalated and spiraled after that for 10 years until he came into the office. So that was the ACES score. This was this individual's experience. And then I just want to show a clip of Dr. Rob Anda, who is the internist turned epidemiologist. And I was at this lecture that was given in Calgary. The Alberta Family Wellness Initiative flew him up to Calgary, and he was part of this huge symposium where they had the leading scientists talk about their work around what they call brain science, the impact of trauma in the developmental years on health. And this was a really important moment for me as a clinician to start to think about, and I'd worked at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center for 5 or 6 years already, and it completely shifted my frame of reference. And I've been criticized for saying this, but I really strongly feel that the impact of this science on health will be viewed one day as being as foundational as hand washing was learned to be in the course of medical history. So this is Dr. Rob Anda talking about the impact that the data he was finding in the original ACES study had. So.
Addiction. Here's the percent of people who report they're addicted to drugs. Less than 1% to 9%. Again, a more than tenfold increase in the risk of addiction. I had never seen numbers like this before, and I haven't seen them since, where you see this laddered dose response. I can tell you there's other epidemiologists at the CDC that spend their whole lives torturing their databases trying to find something that shows a dose-response relationship, because you can get that published and people begin to believe your information. When you see dose response, it helps with causal inference. Okay? And also, where you see risks that are 10 or 20-fold greater, you almost never see that either. And we see this over and over again for major health and social problems. Alcoholism, we have self-reported alcoholism here on the left, and it affects our relationships. Who we tend to be in relationship with, the probability of growing up and marrying an alcoholic goes up as the ACE score goes up 3, 4, 5-fold. The same holds true for growing up and being in an intimate relationship with someone who is sexually violent or physically violent or addicted to street drugs. Well, mental health. Dr. Cameron showed this, I'm going to show it again, depression. I like to show this because this is a leading cause of disability in developed countries. The pink is for women, ACE score 0, going up, cumulative increase, dose response. 60% of women with ACE score 4 or more. 60% of women with ACE score 4 or more have a lifetime history of major depression. See the same pattern for men, although they're less likely to have major depression in their lives. Suicide. Attempted suicide. 1% to 20%. A 20-fold increase in the risk of attempting suicide. 20-fold increase.
So as the study progressed, and it's been replicated several times, what they found was not only was there a link to emotional or mental health disorders, addictions, a variety of social considerations, so ability to form and keep relationships, to secure and maintain housing, and so forth. But there was also a host of other physical illness that they had completely not expected to show up in their data. So that was an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, lung disease, kidney disease, certain forms of cancer, and so forth, which is why the CDC has become increasingly kind of engaged in this work. So.
And another thing that I thought was really fascinating is just the fact that those increases in cardiovascular disease were still there even when they controlled for some of the lifestyle things that you might think could drive that increase. So even when they controlled for things like smoking and substance use, the higher rates of cardiovascular disease in individuals with higher ACES scores was still there. So obviously this is an area where randomized controlled trials are not even close to being ethical to even dream of. And whenever there's two variables that seem to be really strongly correlated and we wonder if there's a causal relationship there, but we can't do an RCT, there's something called the Bradford-Hill criteria that epidemiologists use to sort of suggest that there could be maybe a causal link there, even though we can't definitively prove it. So it's just like with smoking and lung cancer, we're not doing RCTs, but at some point we come to suspect that there's a true causal relationship there. So Rob Anda talked a little bit about some of that criteria. So the fact that there's this dose response where the higher your ACES score goes, the higher your rates of adult disease are. It's also a really strong relationship. Like these are not little tiny numbers. These are huge differences. But another one of the Bradford-Hill criteria is there a plausible biological mechanism to explain this? So how on earth is it that being exposed to the last slide, all of these things, sorry, I know it's flipping back and forth, how is it that these 10 things happening in childhood can lead to such high increases in all of this? If you want to go to the next one. Yeah. All of this decades later after the abuse is no longer occurring. So I am not a neurobiologist by any means, but people smarter than me have studied this a lot, and they've told us that yes, there's a number of different mechanisms that could explain why these changes are occurring so consistently. So if we want to go to the next one. I'm going to go really quick through these because, again, I'm not a neurobiologist, but I do think it's really important for clinicians to understand that there's some biochemical differences in the patients who we're seeing with high ACE scores. And depending on the patient, sometimes that can be really powerful for the patient to understand that, no, this is not in your head. There are some biological differences that you're struggling against because of what you experienced as a child. So first of all, if you look at the brains of people who have higher ACE scores, they have smaller volumes in their hippocampus and their prefrontal cortex. Those areas both have a role in regulating stress responses. So it's, some people have theorized that smaller brain volume, that genuinely different structure of the brain can contribute to some of the decreases that we see in executive function. So planning, judgment, impulse control, all of those things that are can contribute to substance use disorder. They also tend to have a lower set point for a physiological stress response in their body. So if you take a group of people with a high ACE score and a group of people with a lower ACE score of less than 4, and you show them stressful stimuli in a safe environment. And these are all individuals who are not in any danger. This is years after they've experienced any form of abuse, to the researchers' knowledge anyways, and you show them this stressful stimuli. The group with the higher ACES score tends to have much higher activation of their fear responses on functional brain imaging. If you do blood work, they also have increased neuroendocrine responses compared to the control group, and they have increased levels of inflammatory markers. And I think especially that inflammation is really key because we're starting to learn so much more about how inflammation drives disease in so many different organ systems. The fact that inflammation is higher in people with high ACE scores, I think it makes a lot of sense for why so many different organ systems could be affected later in life. Another thing that we see is that people with high ACE scores tend to have glucocorticoid resistance. So this isn't resistance like if you give them prednisone, they're still going to respond to it. This is more physiological levels of glucocorticoids in the body. So in a healthy individual, in a perfect world, When your brain says release glucocorticoid, it releases a chemical called corticotropin releasing hormone, and then that tells your body to release cortisol. Then the glucocorticoid, cortisol, comes back up and tells your brain, okay, we got enough cortisol on board, things are good, let's dial it down a little bit. And so the inflammation eventually gets turned on after the stressful experience. But in individuals who have experienced child abuse, what happens is the glucocorticoid resistance means that the CRH release never gets turned off. It just keeps going and going and going. And so even long after a stressful experience has passed, that inflammatory response continues on and on. They think that epigenetics probably has something to do with this. This is more based on animal studies, where animals who have been exposed to a stressful event early on in their little animal lives have markers, chemical markers on the gene that codes for a glucocorticoid receptor, and those markers inhibit it. So they interrupt the normal expression of that gene. And it intuitively would make sense that if you're not able to express a receptor for a chemical very well, you're going to develop a little bit of resistance to that chemical down the road. And what's interesting is that those chemical markers on the gene, they don't move. Like once they're there for life. They're not labile, they don't fluctuate over time. And so it really supports how just one incident in, again, animal childhood, because these are animal studies, can have these long-lasting effects on the actual genetics of the animal for the rest of its life.
And so once this science started coming to the forefront, gradually, where you can see it used is the World Health Organization uses this in a lot of the work that they're doing. The CDC still uses this. They have websites around it, applications. One of the leading universities in this area, Harvard University, has a whole center on the developing child where they take these scientific concepts. They have a series of working papers related to it, and they've made on their website the science fairly accessible both for clinicians, for lay public, for parents, and they've tried to kind of capture some of these in video format so that they're more digestible. And there's a lot of interplay, because the important thing about ACES is it's not a crystal ball. It doesn't write in stone one's health outcomes or social outcomes. However, what they find is there's a much higher risk, a dramatically higher risk of developing the adverse health outcomes in adulthood. And one of the outcomes as well, and Nancy was speaking to this a little bit, is a lot of the the executive function, what we call executive function. So emotional regulation, decision making, impulse control happens in the frontal lobes, and the effects of cortisol, elevated cortisol levels in developmental years will actually prevent the development of that part of the brain, which is why very often we see certain behaviors manifesting. And when I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, if you can this is just to cue me to talk about it. So I think has really done, and I say this without exaggeration, I think really legendary work in kind of finding the science. And the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative is funded by a family who has a lot of resources at their disposal, but it's completely philanthropically based. And over the last decade or so, they've invested about $80 million in Alberta to help bring the science to the forefront. They've had a series of symposia where they invited judges, lawyers, parole officers, social workers, superintendents, kindergarten teachers, high school teachers, frontline physicians, policymakers in government, just a real slice through society to try to infuse the science through society and help people to kind of apply it on the front lines. And if you check out their website, you'll see really the great work that they're doing. And so one of the things that they did, so when I had originally heard this, I thought, I have always assumed that my clients have a really high burden of ACEs, but we've never really looked at what that means qualitatively, quantitatively, and this might be an approach to do that. And so I just did a pilot with 66 of my clients, and I administered the ACES survey. I contextualized it in the science, and I was quite overwhelmed at the response because I wasn't sure how people would respond to me asking about their trauma, and some of the clients were newer, some I'd known for years at that point. And I would say almost without exception, there was really, really positive feedback that I was able to help them share that part of their lives and to help them to understand what might be scientifically explained, a connection between the developmental years and the health challenges they were facing as adults. And one thing we often come back to is that people still have accountability for their lives, but I think that it mitigates to some degree the responsibility that people carry for why they face the burdens and the challenges that they do. And so one of the things that the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative did is that it had an initiative called the Change in Mind. And so there were 5 Alberta sites. The Boyle Macaulay Health Centre was one of them. There's CASA here in Edmonton. There was Big Brothers, Big Sisters in Calgary, CUPS, and shoot, I'm drawing a blank. Okay, forgive me if you're in here and you participated in that, but it's on here somewhere. But CUPS, Big Brothers, Boyle Macaulay, CASA, anyway. And then there were 10 U.S. sites, and over 2 years they provided some opportunities for us to learn the science and to kind of infuse it through our respective organizations at the frontline level, in a agency level, and then in ways that we could advocate for its promotion outside of our own agencies. And so over that 2-year period, we were able to focus on several things, and Nancy will talk about some of the things that we did with that. And next slide. And so takes us to the Boyle Macaulay Health Centre. And so I just thought I'd mention a little bit about the Boyle Macaulay Health Centre because some people are aware of the health centre, some people aren't sure really what we do. And so it's a community-owned and operated health center. We do receive funding, kind of arm's length, through AHS for the operating budget. The physicians are on an ARP, and we have a funding mandate to care for the marginalized populations in the Edmonton, usually in the inner city area, but really we have kind of an inclusive criteria. So if people arrive and they're homeless or vulnerable, or they have vulnerability around their housing, if they have complex medical concerns, substance use disorders, involvement with corrections, they don't have health care, we take those clients if they're pregnant automatically. And we have patient-centered teams, and the teams include physicians, nurse practitioners who manage their panels autonomously. We have 9 physicians right now. All of us have training in the integration or the treatment of substance use disorders in primary care. 6 of us have certificates of added competency in addictions medicine, but we provide the full breadth of primary health care services. We have LPNs, social workers, psychologists, some psychiatrists. We have some specialists who come and do visits. We have a dental clinic, and that serves that population. So when we administered the surveys, and as of end of March of this year, we had administered the survey to about 225 people, which is a challenge when the number may not seem huge, but when you considered all the other things we're trying to address and the way we kind of framed it for these clients, it was pretty impressive. So I'll just take you through these 2 graphs just for a second. So the original CDC study found that in the general population, there's about a 12% prevalence of individuals with a high-risk ACE score, so that was 4 out of 10. 4 or greater out of 10. And when they did the Alberta study in 2013, then it was Sheila McDonald and Suzanne Tuff, I believe. So they found that in the sample that they had of about 1,200 individuals, that again, the prevalence of a high-risk ACE score in Alberta was about 12% in the general population that they sampled. And when we sampled the Boyle Macaulay Health Centre, we found that the prevalence of a high-risk ACE score was about 93%, and the mode was 10 out of 10. And it was fairly staggering to see these graphs side by side, mirror images, and it correlated because when we looked at individuals who had scores of 10 out of 10, we found that there was an astronomically higher burden of illness amongst these compared to the general population. And so it informs the way we provide services, primary healthcare services, and but it was important for us to see that, and there were other practical applications relating to that. And so so I'll just leave it there for now, and I'll just turn it over to Nancy, come back to things.
So, like Francesco talked about, our clinic, and we really with Francesco championing it, really embraced this whole field of knowledge, this whole science, this whole approach. And with the Change in Mind initiative, there was a lot of work done. So the providers and all of our staff had about 2 days of training on just the backstory, the science involved, and then also how to administer ACES surveys in a non-triggering, non-harmful way to our patients. Another thing that I think was really crucial and really influenced by that, what we learned through those days, or what they learned through those days, was that when the fentanyl crisis was sort of declared and there was a little bit of extra funding available, the clinic actually approached the government to ask for funding for trauma psychologists rather than more OAT prescribers. Because we had OAT prescribers, but what we really wanted was trauma psychologists to work on the team so that our patients who had these high ACE scores would have supports available. To work on some of the root causes of their illnesses, whether it be substance use disorders or other areas of their health. Staff are still encouraged, and new staff that are hired going forward are encouraged to learn more about this by completing the brain science course. So for myself, the Change in Mind initiative actually happened before I started working at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center, so I wasn't involved in that in any way, shape, or form. I came to work at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center and learned a little bit about it from Francesco, and then he suggested do the brain science course. So really that was how I learned about all of this, was through this free online course. It's really good. I completed it while I was still a resident, really, and I can't speak highly enough about it. It's engaging. If you're like me and you don't like to have to read and scroll, it's mostly videos, so you can knit or do laundry or wash dishes while you go through it. And it's more designated, more designed to be, it's for everyone. So it's for early childhood educators, parole officers. It's very engaging, and it's not too nitty-gritty or anything like that. It's really good. It's not accredited with everyone, but you can definitely get non-accredited credits for it. I think I had a whole year's supply of credits just from doing that one course. If you don't have time to go through that, and again, there's no time limit, so you can take 6 months to complete it if you just want to work away at it. The website that this is on, so if you just Google Brain Science Course or Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, you'll find the website that has the course on it, but they also have a ton of other videos that are really engaging and really just short little snippets, summarizing lots of concepts. So can I get out of here? I'll just maybe show you guys.
And can I, well, you can.
Yeah, do that.
So this is a video which the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative developed based on the science that they encouraged people to use. And this was a video, I went out to do some paperwork and I said, you just take a few minutes and watch this and we'll talk about it with this young man that I saw. And so it's just open access, and it's a great resource that kind of encapsulates things, so.
So lots of good resources, all by topic. Sometimes I'll share this with family and friends who wonder why I want to work at a place like the Boyle Macaulay Health Center and why do people find it so hard to stop using drugs. There's some really, if you don't want to have to give that spiel again, you can just point them in the direction of this and show them some of these videos. Are you guys okay if we show the video now?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Do we have, yeah.
Yeah.
So as an example,
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, A brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Yeah, thanks. So sometimes I think people are a little bit intimidated when they hear about how we had this 2-year pilot project at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center to try and put some of this science into action. I have worked in fee-for-service environments, and after I took this course, I was able to start applying it right away in all the different areas that I worked in. I really don't think people should feel like they need to train their entire staff before they can start to use this in their practice. You should, and if you do, that's great, but it really, just having that basic knowledge starts to improve your practice right away, I find, both for your patients, but also just for you, making it a little bit more fulfilling. So in terms of how I started to kind of put it into practice, honestly, for 3 or 4 months after I took the course, I didn't feel comfortable asking about ACEs. So that's the first thing, is even if you don't ever plan on doing a formal ACEs survey with your patients, you can still take the course and use the material in your practice. Eventually, I did start to administer ACEs surveys on my patients, and that was nice. Personally, for me, I don't rush it. I don't do it on my initial intake. I wait until I have a little bit more of a relationship with the patient. Other practitioners are different. There's certain providers providers at our clinic who do it on the first visit with every patient that they meet, if the patient consents to it. I always give them a little bit of a backstory, sort of like Francesco has spoken about today, to explain why I'm suddenly asking these invasive questions when they just told me that all they have is diabetes and a drinking problem, and what does that have to do with what happened to me when I was a kid? And I give them the option of going through the survey with me, or some patients just prefer to look over the questions on their own, and I'll step out of the room and they can grab me if they have any questions afterwards. One thing that some people say at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center is, even if you just stop there, even if you've just given them the information and then gone through the survey with them, that in and of itself can be really powerful for patients. Most of the time we like to use the results a little bit, so we'll kind of build on that and make some connections for the patients. So it really depends on the patient what this looks like. Oftentimes the biggest theme is we just talk about their resilience. So we talk about how the average ACE score in Alberta is way less than 4, and you have an ACE score of 9. You know, oftentimes I find in our population, because the people we're seeing, they grew up with people who had equally traumatizing childhoods. So they think it's normal, and they think, why am I complaining about all of this stuff that happened to me? Because this happens to everyone. And so to be able to show them that graph, it shows like, actually, most people in Alberta didn't have any of this stuff happen to them. Most people had a score of 4 or less, not 9. That can be really empowering for patients. Sometimes we'll talk about how they're survivors, the suicide rate being, 20-fold higher for people with higher ACE scores can be pretty powerful for people. Just being there is a celebration of their strength. Sometimes I see parents who are actually doing really well and are running into roadblocks, and they're really hard on themselves and they wish they were better parents. And so sometimes I'll use this, I'll say, hey, we've talked about what your ACE score is. What do you think your child's ACE score would be? And oftentimes they'll say, 3. My score is 10, my kid's score is 3. And it's just amazing to point out for them how they're able to break that cycle and how they're really giving their kids a really good, foundation, despite the fact that they didn't get that. Francesco, sorry to put you on the spot, but you have a really nice metaphor that you use sometimes when you're talking to patients about going to the gym.
Yeah, sure.
I quite like it.
Okay. So yeah, it seems to resonate with a lot of clients, and the reason I use it is because I'll actually go back to this client actually. So, after I took him through kind of the ACES survey and we talked about his experience, and it was really, I don't know how to say, it was really moving to see how he was able to reframe his life experiences and to connect it to why he was struggling so much, how he was self-medicating to, the effects of the trauma he'd experienced. And he said, it was insight, it gave him insight that he hadn't had before, and he suddenly stopped being as hard on himself. Because when he came in and he finally admitted that he had a substance use disorder and he stopped lying, he said, his words were, I'm paraphrasing, I'm a piece of crap. He said, and I just can't stop. He said, I have tried so hard and I've tried so many times and I've tried asking for help and it's not worked. And so, but for him, and I share this experience because it really is characteristic of the experience I've had working with individuals who have really deeply entrenched substance use disorders, that when I talk to them about the science and help them to reframe it, and I think I'm reframing it for myself because I feel like I've been able to let go of judgment that I've had of individuals who might have some of these challenges, and it really changed him. And one example I gave him about the resilience is I said, imagine you go into a gym and the weights are invisible, but everyone's got to lift weights. And you see one guy's got perfect form and he's like doing tons of reps. And then you see another guy who's really struggling to lift what looks like, he's just struggling. But you can't see the weights, and then the gym owner gives you some goggles that allow you to see the weights. And then you see that the first guy, who seems to be killing it, right, is lifting 10 pounds, which might represent an ACE score of 1. And the other guy who's lifting, 100 pounds, 200, 300 pounds, which might represent an ACE score of 10, is really struggling. But in reality, when you consider all the barriers someone might face as a result of the developmental trauma they experience, they're actually doing remarkably well. And that's what I like to point out, is that there's patterns of resilience that emerge that are really incredible to witness. And so in this fellow's case, he went from saying, I just need these pills refilled, to saying, I will try Suboxone. I'll walk out of here and go on Suboxone. And he did, and he got set up to go to treatment. And it was a massive shift in his thinking and in his acceptance of what we recommended as safer clinical options. And for other clients, even if they're not ready, I've yet to have an experience where people say, this is garbage. It always resonates with them. And sometimes we just see improved compliance, and we don't have funding for like extensive research, but what we notice anecdotally is our clients will start to take their HIV medications. It helps people reframe their approach to weight loss. It helps them to rethink about who they are and how they feel about themselves. And it does lead, in my experience, to improved clinical outcomes. And I do think it makes a difference to these individuals. And as Nancy pointed out, those with generations that follow them start to see that they can make a difference as grandparents or as parents, which is really important.
So these are just sort of some other pearls and benefits, and we've covered a few of these. I had sort of touched on, don't feel like you have to feel comfortable administering an ACE score to be able to learn more about brain science and use it. Some other sort of benefits, or I find knowing a little bit about a patient's trauma really helps me to gain trust with them, but also to just avoid re-traumatizing them and re-triggering them. So some of it's intuitive, but sometimes I'll just ask, thank you for sharing this with me. Is there anything I can do to try and help you feel more comfortable in our clinic, help you feel more comfortable talking to me about these things? We talked about how really, even though we were asked to speak mostly about opioid use disorder, it applies to all chronic diseases really, really well, especially when they're stigmatized ones, so like obesity and substance use disorder, for opioids or alcohol or methamphetamine. I find it really helps me to, like Francesco I think kind of alluded to, it helps me to better understand some of the more frustrating behaviors of some of my patients. And I think they know that, like they kind of sense that after we've gone through this, they know that I do realize they're trying and that it's hard. It's hard for them to come to appointments on time. It's hard for them to show up for their specialist appointments. It's hard for them to go to the pharmacy every day for their methadone or their Suboxone. Instead of just being frustrated and thinking you're not trying, we both have a bit of an understanding that we know they're doing their best and that, like Francesco said, they're struggling against barriers that not everyone has to face. So I just find for me, it really kind of helps that relationship and just for burnout prevention, personally. And I think patients, after they've learned about this and learned about the science, they're generally just a little bit more open to addressing some of their other issues. So addressing mental health, and acknowledging that maybe there is more of a relationship between the mind and the body than they initially were willing to admit. And I think it's less stigmatizing for them to seek mental health treatment if they understand that it's affecting their overall health as well. I'm guessing in the room probably people are thinking of like reasons why this maybe wouldn't work in their clinic. I don't know. When we rolled it out, or when they rolled it out at the Boyle Macaulay Health Center even, there was a lot of doubt and concern about what it would look like. So one of the thoughts was, at that point we didn't have trauma psychologists, so a lot of people were worried that we would bring up all of this trauma for patients and then we had nothing to offer. At that point we really only had mental health workers at the PCN, I think. And a lot of people were worried about opening Pandora's box and not having people to refer our patients to. But really, that wasn't an issue. patients were just grateful to have the opportunity to share their experiences. And eventually we did advocate for funding for trauma psychologists, and everyone should do that. It's great. They're an amazing part of our team, but we were using ACES long before they came along and using it with really, really good results. What are other barriers? Time, I guess. So I think, it takes time to properly do an ACES survey. If you plan for it, like sometimes at my other job, I would sort of introduce it at one visit and then plan for it and book a longer visit to go through it with them, if they were interested in that. And I think in the end, it almost saves time. When it's it's a big upfront investment, but once you've been through it, I find sometimes it does save time in the long run because you just have a better relationship with your patient and communication is a little bit better. I don't want to lie and say, oh yeah, it doesn't add time to your day, but I think it's worthwhile. You'd agree? Are there any other barriers that you guys can think of?
Probably address that in the panel.
Yeah, and you can, oh, yeah.
Have you had the experience of offending a patient
Yeah.
by offering the option to do the
Totally.
Maybe repeat the question.
So the question was worrying about offending a patient by offering the survey. I haven't come across that personally. I think part of it is if you frame it in the science and if sometimes I don't do it on all my patients, so I don't say that. I know some providers do it in the first visit on all of their patients, and they say, I offer this to all of my patients in our first visit, would you like to do this? And then they can say yes or no.
Can I,
Yeah.
So just a thought to that. I have a really clear memory of an experience I had, and this is not going to be a typical patient, but it was a man who'd spent 23 years in a maximum security prison, and he came out. He's HIV positive. He'd been referred to us by his infectious diseases specialist. He had a host of other challenges, and one of them was a substance use disorder. And I said, and I was at the end of the visit, which was already quite lengthy, and I said, can you just do this survey with me, because I think it'll help us to understand some of your health challenges, and I didn't really contextualize it, and I don't know what your approach was, but this was my experience, and we got through question 1 about emotional abuse, question 2, physical abuse, no, we got to question 3, sexual abuse, and he said, this has nothing to do with my effing life, so let's just drop it. And so I said, okay, and I said, look, I owe you an apology. I tried to just dive into this without really giving you some context. And what I did is I kind of went back and I just said, let me tell you about this study that was done in San Diego, Dr. Vincent Folletti, and then how he paired up with kind of what we talked about tonight. And by the end of it, and I said, what we found is that people who have these experiences, it really changes the way their brain works in some ways and the experiences they have and the barriers they face. And I said, do you want to take another run at the survey? And his entire, his posture, his mood had changed. And he said, yeah, I'd really like to. And he scored 10 out of 10. And he was able to open up about some of these factors when he realized that, because society told him you're a piece of trash and you belong in the trash. And when he got out into civilian society, he really had a hard time understanding that he was anything different or that his experiences meant anything different than what he'd been taught, right? And that won't be everyone's experience. And the other thing I found is timing too. I pick up on cues. So when my clients start using self-deprecating commentary, so when they kind of talk abusively about themselves, about their failures, about their discouragement, I often find that is a great doorway to say, can we approach this differently? Can we reframe how you're thinking about this? And let me just tell you about what will seem like a completely unrelated study that happened in the early 90s about obesity. And when I take them through that way, like I say, I have had consistently, time over time, really positive experiences. And sometimes it is the timing. And it depends who, because sometimes, we have some nurses in our clinic who have really good rapport with clients, and then maybe it's them who administers it, or maybe it's the social worker, or maybe it's the mental health therapist, and then that information can come back. But I'm in a position to speak about it in a way that may enhance the therapeutic relationship that's needed to help individuals with all their health issues, including substance use disorders.
And after you've given that initial sort of context, that intro, you're asking the patient, do you want to know more about this? Are you interested in going through this survey with me now? And I do have patients that say, not today. I'm not going there today, but I appreciate you telling me about this. And they'll bring it up at future visits. Or I've even had like one of my patients who I had just met saw Francesco, and he gave her a little blurb. She didn't want to go through the survey that day, but then she brought it up with me the next time, and she's like, hey, I think I'm ready to tell you guys a little bit more about that. So it's not always, done in one visit too. We just have a video of a doctor who works in a fee-for-service clinic. Are we doing okay for time? Just speaking about her experiences implementing brain science. Okay. Oh, good call.
Brain science is relatively new in the history of medicine, and the understanding of its connection to mental health, addiction, chronic disease, prenatal outcomes, childhood growth and development. Again, it's relatively new and it's really complex. The challenges are significant. The Brain Story course is a forum that has enabled me to review the brain science or the foundational building blocks of brain development and the very complex underpinnings of why what happens as a child is the foundation for what you are potentially at risk for as an adult. We really need to be working with families, with dads, moms, babies, our pregnant patients, to aim for that primary prevention where we can hopefully raise families in safe and healthy communities and environments. We're rolling out a full clinic project where all 43 physicians that work at our Riley Park Maternity Clinic will be routinely asking the ACE score on each pregnant patient. I can definitely say that when we asked patients what it was like to be asked their ACE score, the majority said that they felt better understood by their care provider, comforted, thankful to be asked, and that for me personally, it has really enriched my practice. I feel like I can build a better therapeutic relationship with my patients by knowing their history more thoroughly. I would really encourage all of my colleagues to take the Brain Story certification course. It's an accessible and amazing way to learn how to become a trauma-informed care provider.
So, I think we're planning to take questions as part of the panel. I think we may, yeah. And so just in conclusion, this has been our approach to working with individuals who have really complex medical, psychiatric challenges, including substance use disorders. And I realize that a lot of this is anecdotal. The science is there, and it's interesting because when I've been taught, the mantra is once you learn the science or once you learn some of this underpinning kind of science, then you find ways to apply it in your own clinical practice in a way that kind of suits your personality, that suits the pre-existing relationships that you might have with your clients. And but I really do think that it makes a huge difference when we're looking at opiate use disorders specifically to try to frame it and contextualize it in something much broader than just the chemical addiction. And so I'm appreciative of the experience that I've had to be exposed to this, to have opportunities to apply it, and especially because it really has transformed the way that I've approached working with individuals who have substance use disorders. And anything else, Dr. Easton? All right, so thanks for your attention and for the opportunity, and we are quite accessible. There's our contact information. We'll be answering some questions this evening, and I would really encourage you, to check out the Brain Story certification course. It's free, it's very high level, but very accessible, and it's being used around the world, actually. If you look on their website, there's places in the UK, Australia, the U.S. where they're using this to help people in every discipline. So, thank you.
So I want to really thank the both of you, Dr. Musego and Dr. Easton. That was, I think, very interesting in an area that I am just starting to learn about. And I was particularly struck by what you said about how it helps the patients to frame what they're thinking, but it also helps us to frame how we're thinking about the patient. So benefit on both sides. That's very interesting.